Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the system shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a critical deep dive into a really foundational work of political analysis, Robert O. Paxton's landmark book, The Anatomy of Fascism.
And it feels like a necessary text, because honestly, the word fascism gets thrown around so much.
It really does. It's almost been rendered meaningless through overuse.
Yeah, if you're like most people, you probably hear it used constantly, mostly as a political insult. It's just a convenient moral label, a quick way to write off an opponent as evil or, irrational.
But that doesn't actually tell us anything, does it?
No, nothing about the underlying mechanics.
Exactly. And that is precisely the misunderstanding Paxton wants to correct. A lot of people see fascism as this static, fixed ideology, maybe as a radical anti-capitalism or just an anti-modern reaction.
They're kind of turning back of the clock.
Right. But Paxton argues that this focus on ideology, it blinds us to what fascism actually is, which is a historical systemic phenomenon.
Okay, so it's not a philosophy printed in a pamphlet that just springs into existence.
Not at all. It's a process working itself out over time. It evolves, it adapts, and crucially, it compromises to gain power.
Okay, let's unpack this. So our mission today isn't just to, condemn it, which is easy to do. We're trying to perform an intensive autopsy on a political structure. We want to understand its livers, its alliances, its contradictions.
Precisely. We are moving beyond the abstract definitions to look at actions, incentives, and strength. And this is key, the institutional alliances fascism needed to function in practice.
So actions over words.
Always. When you treat it as a historical movement, its definition becomes fluid. It's based on its trajectory, not its starting platform. I mean, take the word itself, fascism.
From the Italian fascio, a bundle.
Yes, which recalls the Latin fasces, the bundle of rods with an axe. It was carried before Roman magistrates to signify state authority, state unity, the power of the collective over the individual.
And what's so fascinating is that, historically, that symbol wasn't just a thing of the far right.
Not at all. Before 1914, that symbolism was often used by the left. Syndicalists, revolutionary unions, they used it to represent proletarian unity.
So how did it flip?
Well, that's the point. Even if you look internationally, you can find the fasces on the Lincoln Memorial or on the U.S. quarter from 1932. The symbol itself wasn't inherently fascist. Its meaning was co-opted and totally transformed by the political context.
So that confusion, that fluidity of definition, was that actually a necessary precondition for them to gain traction?
Oh, absolutely. That confusion lets a movement appeal to a wider base. When your ideology is defined more by what you oppose, the left, liberalism, internationalism, cultural decay, rather than what you consistently stand for.
You can be a catch-all for anyone with a grievance.
Exactly, a catch-all for all kinds of disgruntled groups. And Paxton argues this fluidity is central to its early success, which, just underscores why we need a rigorous historical analysis like his, one that looks at function, not just the label.
So let's introduce the author who guides us through this. Robert O. Paxton. He's a major historian of modern Europe, taught for decades at Columbia University.
And he's renowned for his really rigorous archival-based work. I mean, many people might know his definitive study, Vichy France, which just completely challenged France's national myths about collaboration during World War II.
So he has a background in studying authoritarianism and how ordinary institutions can become complicit.
Right, which made him uniquely suited to tackle fascism itself. And the real impetus behind this book was his frustration with how vaguely, even ahistorically, the term was being used. He essentially said, stop looking for the one true definition in some 1919 pamphlet.
Because if you focus only on those early philosophical doctrines, which Paxton notes were casually fluid,
you miss the real story.
Which is how these movements actually survived and seized the machinery of a modern state.
Indeed. It's like trying to understand a massive river just by looking at its source. Paxton insists that focusing on those early doctrines is, and this is a quote, much less helpful in understanding the middle ranges of the fascist cycle.
So the early stuff might have been radical, even revolutionary sounding, to stir up the base.
But what they actually did to seize and hold on to power, that tells the real story. And this approach is really the intellectual core of the book. It treats fascism as a dynamic political actor, not some static religious text.
Which leads us directly to his central thesis.
And we can state it pretty clearly. For Paxton, fascism is best understood not by what movements claim to believe in their initial programs, but by observing what they do over time.
Their entire fascist itinerary, as he calls it.
Exactly. And that itinerary is a multi-stage process. You have stage one, the foundation, when the movement is still marginal. Then stage two, where it gets a foothold in the political system, usually through alliances. Stage three is the actual acquisition of power.
And stage 4 is how they exercise that power, which is where all the contradictions between their rhetoric and their rule come out.
That's it. So to really get a handle on fascism, you have to follow its messy historical course. You have to pay attention to the compromises, the betrayals, the contradictions. The focus is always on action.
It's a series of historical choices.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only look at that early, bombastic rhetoric,
You're giving them too much credit for philosophical coherence, and you're missing the huge structural forces that actually let them succeed. They weren't successful because they were great thinkers. They were successful because they were pragmatic, often intellectually dishonest, and willing to abandon any principle that got in the way of power.
Okay, let's dig into those core ideas then and start mapping that itinerary. Fascism wasn't born in a vacuum, right? It was a response to a very specific, very acute crisis.
Absolutely. Paxton points to the overwhelming failure of liberal democracy after two huge interconnected events: the trauma of World War I and the existential threat of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917.
So the old institutions just couldn't cope.
The core liberal institutions that had defined the 19th century parliament, the free market, the education system, they just seemed completely incapable of handling the emergencies of this new mass society.
And when you say emergencies, I mean, we need to remember the scale of the instability back then. It's often forgotten.
The scale was brutal, and it was everywhere in Europe. First, you have mass demobilization. Millions of traumatized veterans thrown onto the labor market. Massive unemployment.
And the economic chaos.
Catastrophic. Runaway inflation, especially in Germany, just wiped out the lifetime savings of the middle and lower middle classes. That completely destroys faith in the whole system. Then you have huge social tensions, disruptions to international trade from war debts.
And on top of all that, a new political reality.
Yes, crucially, the vote had been extended to masses of people working class rural voters who the old elites saw as poorly educated citizens. Totally unprepared for civic responsibility, it created this fear of ungovernability.
So in the face of all this chaos, the liberals, what was their solution?
They basically expected a return to the pre-war normal, a minimal state, self-regulating markets. But modern industrial war had demanded huge state intervention.
You couldn't put the genie back in the bottle.
The bottle was shattered, and this left a massive political vacuum. So fascism steps forward with these radical new solutions that seem so much more decisive than the fumbling of the traditional conservatives or the helpless liberals.
Their message was simple. Liberals failed because they were weak. We will impose order through strength and total national unity.
Precisely. And what really made this environment so combustible was the fear of socialism.
The post-1917 fear of mass politics.
Absolutely. The whole context was dominated by this immediate existential fear of international communism. Lenin's success in Russia set off fire bells, as Paxton puts it, across the middle and upper classes.
A desperate search for a response to Bolshevism.
A panicky, desperate search between 1918 and 1922. The middle classes feared having their property taken. The establishment feared the complete dissolution of the social order.
And this is where fascists succeeded, where the traditional conservatives failed. The old right-wing establishment, they just wanted to keep the masses out of politics entirely.
Right, they wanted deference, obedience, maybe a return to monarchy. But the fascists, they understood the new reality of mass mobilization. They never wanted to keep the masses out.
On the contrary.
They wanted to enlist, discipline, and energize them. But for nationalist ends, not class ends, they got that you couldn't run a 20th century state on 19th century apathy.
So they pioneered these new forms of engagement, the big rallies, the propaganda.
Exciting public spectacles, sophisticated publicity, promising to replace messy, divisive elections with these grand plebiscites of mass assent, expressing the supposed unified will of the nation.
They were modern demagogues who understood that you had to channel that mass energy, purify it, and drive it toward a single goal. Which brings us to the crucial mechanism of power, the alliance with the existing elites.
This point is maybe the most vital takeaway from Paxton's entire analysis, and it's the one that's most often misunderstood. Fascist movements, which started as these, noisy, thuggish, marginal sects.
Stage one, as he calls it.
Right. They could only transition into viable political player stage 2, and then seize power stage 3 through the complicity and accommodation of the existing conservative elites.
So we're talking about the traditional gatekeepers, the army, high command, the monarchy, big landowners, powerful industrialists, the established civil service.
They held the actual institutional keys to the state. And their incentive to, flirt with these uncouth outsiders like Hitler and Mussolini was just desperate self-preservation.
Fear of the left was the primary driver.
Paramount. These elites, known in Italy as fianceggiatori, literally flankers or backers, they saw socialism as the greater apocalyptic threat to their property, their stability, their whole social hierarchy.
So they made a cold calculation, used the fascist street fighters as a club to beat the organized left. But surely they saw the danger, the radicalism of the fascists themselves.
They made a terrible, fatal miscalculation. They believed they could co-opt fascist energy, use them to smash the unions, and then, control them once they were in office.
They were sure these newcomers, Hitler the failed artist, Mussolini the restless revolutionary, couldn't possibly govern a modern state without their help.
Without their expertise, their savoir-faire. In their minds, fascism was a useful temporary servant. They fundamentally underestimated the raw ambition, the capacity for violence, and the organizational genius of the leaders.
Which brings us to the biggest internal contradiction of fascism once it got into power, the gap between rhetoric and reality.
A massive gap. Early fascist rhetoric was full of this passionate, almost revolutionary anger at the economic system.
Yeah, we need to spend some time on this because it really highlights the pragmatic core of the movement versus its populist mask. I remember reading about that intense anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois animus.
It was fierce. They denounced international finance capitalism, filthy money. They promised to expropriate department stores to help small artisans and big landowners to help poor peasants.
Rhetoric designed to rally the people who felt crushed by modernization and globalization.
Exactly. The struggling artisans, the small businessmen, the peasants. But what happened when they actually took control of economic policy?
Great contradiction.
Once in power, they did absolutely nothing to carry out those radical anti-capitalist threats. In fact, in Italy, the fascist government was responsible for the biggest program of privatization in its early years, handing state-owned businesses back to private interests.
It's a fundamental betrayal of their base. How did they handle the radicals in their own movement who felt duped?
That internal management was essential. I mean, the anti-capitalist wing of the Nazi Party, led by people like Gregor Strasser and the SA, the street militia, they were a genuine threat. They saw Hitler's alliance with the elites as a betrayal of the movement's revolutionary soul.
They wanted a second revolution, one that would actually involve nationalization.
Precisely. And Hitler settled that contradiction with absolute brutality during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. He used the traditional army and the rising SS to liquidate the SA leadership.
And that sent a very clear message to the conservative elites and big business.
An undeniable signal. The economic status quo, as long as it served national power and war preparation, was safe. The revolutionary rhetoric was dead.
So on the ground, how did that play out for labor and industry?
It played out by enforcing with utmost violence their threats against the political left. They banned strikes, they dissolved independent unions, they systematically lowered workers' purchasing power, and crucially, they showered money on armaments industries, focusing on economic self-sufficiency.
Which immensely satisfied the big national employers.
Of course, they were now shielded from foreign competition and internal labor unrest, so far from overthrowing capitalism, they came to its rescue. They brutally imposed labor discipline, guaranteeing stability and profitability for national producers.
An ultimate bait and switch, using revolutionary language to save the entrenched order.
That's the key synthesis. They respected the property of national producers and protected the social hierarchy. The core commitment wasn't to economic restructuring, it was to national power and military expansion. The economy was just a means to an end.
And that saved order was backed by escalating violence. How did that trajectory unfold?
Paxton maps it carefully. It began with selective, acceptable street violence against anti-national enemies.
Communists, Jews, pacifists.
Anyone seen as a cultural degenerate. And this violence wasn't random, it was strategic. It helped win votes by demonstrating effectiveness and decisiveness to a panicked middle class who were sick of parliamentary gridlock. It was a performance of strength.
And once they were in power, Stage 3.
It moved from street thuggery to state-sponsored exclusion, stripping citizenship, firing civil servants, systematic repression. The violence became institutionalized.
And we see a real difference here between Italy and Germany, especially around the idea of purification.
Yes. The Italian fascists, while racialists, initially focused more on culture and history. Their violence was more directed at colonial subjects in Africa. They only adopted harsh racial laws against Jews later, largely under German pressure.
But Germany's path was much more radical from the start.
Absolutely. There was a deep, pre-existing Volkisch strain, a defense of a biological people against impurities. And this translated the violence into a focus on medicalized purification.
The sterilization programs.
A massive, systematic program of forcible sterilization of the genetically unfit and later the euthanasia of the mentally ill. The Nazis weaponized public health using sophisticated medical and administrative systems for racial goals. This path toward biological liquidation was built on the collaboration of civil servants and medical professionals.
So we need to transition now from the ideas to the deep structural analysis. Let's look at fascism as a working political system. This is where Paxton really moves from description to diagnosis.
Right. And if we map the system, we see this dynamic interplay between three primary actors who are all necessary for success.
Okay, let's start with the base. The mass movements and militants.
These are the shock troops, primarily young, often restless veterans, like the Freikorps in Germany, and what Paxton calls lumpen intellectuals.
The socially marginalized, the failed artists.
Exactly. They provided the raw, intense activism and the willingness to use direct action. They gave the leader the energy and credibility as a truly revolutionary force. They found identity and purpose in this violent fraternity, an escape from what they saw as boring bourgeois life.
Okay, so that's the first actor. The second is obvious, the charismatic leader.
Indispensable. The Deuce, the Führer. Figures like Hitler were experts at manipulating crowds, fanning resentments. The Hitler myth was so powerful that he was sort of exempt from the grumbling people had about the corrupt local party officials. They could blame the system, but their faith in the supreme leader stayed intact.
And the third actor, the one whose choice made all the difference, the conservative elites.
Yes. Those who already held economic, social, and military power. Their choices to ally or to accommodate determined everything. I mean, take the March on Rome in 1922.
Which wasn't really a military conquest at all.
No, it was a gigantic, successful bluff. Mussolini's black shirts were poorly armed and would have been easily defeated by the Italian army. But King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign the martial law decree.
He blocked the army from intervening.
And that turned the bluff into a political victory. The issue was decided not by fascist force, but by the conservatives' unwillingness to risk civil war. They invited him in.
And we see a similar quasi-constitutional drama in Germany.
Absolutely. The Nazi Party reached power quasi-legally in a coalition government. Weimar Germany had been paralyzed for 3 years, governed by emergency decrees. Hitler, as head of the largest party, was the only one who could form a non-socialist majority.
So the conservative power brokers like Hindenburg thought they could contain him.
They thought they had him trapped in a cabinet surrounded by conservatives. They made him chancellor, thinking they had him on a leash.
A fatal miscalculation.
The lesson is that the seizure of power happens not through a coup, but through the deliberate opening of political space by the very people who should be defending the institutions.
So once they're in office, how does the system manage the tension between the Revolutionary Party activists and the traditional old-school civil service?
This creates the famous structure known as the dual state. Fascist regimes never really replace the old state bureaucracy. They just layer a competing structure on top of it. You have the traditional state, the normative state, and the party's competing apparatus, the prerogative state. And they exist in this permanent productive tension.
Productive tension. That sounds incredibly inefficient.
It's inefficient by liberal standards, but very effective for consolidating personal power and achieving radical goals. And the management of this tension was very different in Italy versus Germany.
Okay, how did Mussolini manage the dual state?
In Italy, Mussolini generally subordinated the party to the state. He mistrusted his own local party chieftains and their street militias. He preferred to use professional civil servants for key roles, so the traditional institutions kept a lot of their authority. This normalization meant the Italian police were more professional and executed far fewer political enemies than their Nazi counterparts. Mussolini wanted stability.
And in Germany, Hitler chose chaos.
The politicracy.
Right. After the 1934 purge, he had total control of his party. And he then allowed this chaotic system of rule by multiple competing centers of power. He consciously encouraged competition between party agencies like the SS and the traditional state like the army.
Why would he prefer chaos to a clear hierarchy?
For two reasons. First, it prevented any single rival from consolidating enough power to challenge him. Second, and more ominously, ambiguous commands meant that ambitious underlings were constantly working toward the Führer.
Trying to guess what he wanted and then deliver the most extreme version of it. Exactly. It created a Darwinian competition to prove loyalty by pursuing the most radical anti-Semitic or expansionist policies possible. This just fueled cumulative radicalization. Hitler didn't have to manage the gruesome details. He just articulated the vision, and his lieutenants competed to fulfill it.
That's a terrifying insight. The Holocaust wasn't centrally planned, but emerged from this fragmented competition.
That's a key part of it. It was enabled by fragmented bureaucracies all trying to anticipate the Führer's will.
We should also touch on Gleichschaltung, bringing into line. That sounds like a total replacement of civil society, but you're saying it was more of an interaction.
It was an evolution through interaction, absolutely. I mean, some institutions were just dissolved, like labor unions and political parties. But other areas of society managed to negotiate a partial autonomy. The Catholic Church in Italy, for example, successfully defended its youth movements from total takeover.
So institutions like the church and the army kept enough power to resist being completely absorbed.
Exactly. Even in Germany, the process was complex. University fraternities, for instance, often persisted because powerful Nazi alumni protected them, sort of appropriating the regime's language and organizations for their own prestige.
And we see the same thing with the attempts to control leisure time, like the Italian Dopo Lavoro organization. It was meant to forge the new fascist man.
But in reality, ordinary Italians just used it for their own fun to watch movies, take trips, play sports. It shows the limits of totalitarian reach when it meets basic human inertia. The fascist systems were always amalgams, as Paxton says, of two very different agents, fascist dynamism and conservative order.
Okay, let's connect this historical framework to our present day. And we need to be careful here, not making predictions, but using Paxton's model as a diagnostic tool. What structural vulnerabilities should we be watching for?
His work really helps us differentiate between, noisy fringe movements and moments of true democratic vulnerability. We've seen a resurgence of the radical right in Europe since the 1980s.
Mobilizing around new grievances, immigration, globalization, cultural decline.
But they still display those classical themes. A sense of victimhood, the need for national order, the demonization of internal enemies.
And these successful movements tend to be Stage 2 phenomena, right? They've gained traction, but they aren't purely street movements.
Correct. The movements that stay overtly neo-fascist Stage 1 remain politically impotent. The successful ones have normalized themselves. They've often purged the most overtly racist rhetoric, and they don't threaten democracy directly. They adopt moderate language while still leveraging populist resentment.
But the crucial question remains, what separates the noisy fringe from the one that actually breaches the political establishment?
And Paxton's historical lesson is unshakable on this. Fascist success depends far more on the choices made by the traditional power centers than on the popular vote. The pivotal moment is when mainstream conservative leaders break the quarantine of the radical right.
Usually for short-term political gain.
Or out of desperation because of political deadlock. We saw this in Italy in the 1990s. The old political order collapsed from corruption scandals, creating a vacuum. Silvio Berlusconi's new party formed a coalition in 1994 with the Alleanza Nazionale.
The direct descendant of Mussolini's party.
Yes, and by forming that coalition, Berlusconi, the conservative gatekeeper, broke the 50-year barrier. That act fatally opened the political space. It was the accommodation by the establishment that mattered, not the raw power of the AN movement itself.
So the real danger sign is not just the fiery rhetoric of the outsiders, but the pragmatism or desperation of the insiders who decide to make a deal.
That is the critical hinge in the entire fascist itinerary.
This also brings us to the importance of drawing clear boundaries. The word fascism gets used for any kind of authoritarianism. How does Paxton help us differentiate?
He provides a very sharp analytical boundary. Fascism is specifically a phenomenon of failed democracies that mobilizes a mass following to destroy free institutions in favor of national purification and expansionist war.
So how is that different from, say, traditional right-wing authoritarianism?
Traditional authoritarians like Franco in Spain after the war or Pinochet in Chile, they preferred a passive public. Their rule was based on traditional hierarchies, the army, the church, landowners. Their goal was to maintain the status quo.
They were inherently conservative, not revolutionary.
Exactly. They lacked the demonic energy, the mission to liquidate entire peoples or to radically mobilize the masses. In fact, Franco eventually reduced his single party to a colorless civic association. He actively rejected the defining fascist characteristic, which is that dynamic, mass-based energy and the creation of a new man. If we only look at symbols or violence, we miss that crucial structural difference.
So to bring this all together under our channel's themes, this is fundamentally a study of systems over ideology.
Completely. Paxton moves us beyond viewing fascism as some rigid philosophy and shows it as a dynamic system that exploits the uneven development of society, that tension between pre-industrial elites and the losers of modernization.
And this structural vulnerability is then papered over with what he calls mobilizing passions.
Right. The charismatic leader, the political spectacle. This is how power is hidden behind cultural narratives. Mussolini driving his Alfa Romeo, Hitler arriving by plane. This pageantry was designed to distract from the real mechanisms of control and substitute intense emotion for critical thought.
And the next step is controlling perception by creating the new man or new woman through mass organizations.
Yes, the attempt to penetrate every level of society through youth groups like the Hitler Jugend was central. The goal was to take young people away from traditional influences, parents, teachers, churches, and integrate them into this new, hardened national identity. It was a systematic attack on the private sphere.
And finally, we have to confront the horrifying truth of how institutions normalize radical outcomes. The idea that terror doesn't require a massive police force.
Paxton highlights that the Gestapo was able to maintain control with a relatively small number of officers, and that rested heavily on the willing cooperation of ordinary citizens.
Denunciations.
Using the secret police to settle private scores. This allowed the general population to become a self-policing network of informants. It normalized the terror.
And then, the darkest chapter, the Holocaust, the outermost reach of fascist radicalization.
Enabled by the full-scale collaboration of the traditional bureaucracy, the military, the civil administrators, in that chaotic polycracy, officials competed to enact Hitler's hatreds. It was administered with this grotesque scientific care. It wasn't just fanatic thugs, it was the institutional normalization of hatred and destruction on an industrial scale.
So what's the ultimate lesson Paxton's functional approach gives us? It seems to come down to that distinction between the revolutionary noise and the pragmatic, power-seeking machine.
I think the key lesson is that historical action, the entire itinerary of the movement, matters infinitely more than the labels or the radical doctrine from the early days.
You have to look at the reversal of anti-capitalist rhetoric.
The reliance on the choices of conservative gatekeepers and the destructive expansionist capacity unleashed by war, those are the defining characteristics. If you want to recognize modern threats, you look for the willingness of radical outsiders to discard ideology for power and the willingness of the established right to make the deal.
It also gives us a clear lens for democratic vulnerability. Fascism isn't inevitable. It requires specific conditions and critically human choices, especially the choices made by those currently holding institutional power.
And that leaves us with the unresolved question for today. When modern democracies face severe crises, economic collapse, national humiliation, political deadlock, which groups of existing elites will be the first to choose accommodation with radical outsiders over the difficult, imperfect defense of democratic institutions?
Because history shows the decision to give up free institutions is made not by the fascists in the street, but by the anti-left conservatives who open the door and invite them in. A deeply sobering thought about the responsibility of current political actors. That brings us to the end of this deep dive. We want to thank Robert O. Paxton for his indispensable work, The Anatomy of Fascism, for providing us with the tools to analyze these powerful political systems. If you are intrigued by this discussion, we encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or borrow it from your local library. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.